The fluorescent light above Marcus Thompson's head flickered with that familiar electrical stutter that had marked his nights for the past 3 years. Each pulse cast dancing shadows across the empty hallway of Jefferson Elementary, where the scent of industrial disinfectant mixed with the lingering ghost of children's laughter from earlier that day. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle with practiced efficiency, muscles moving in the rhythm of someone who had found purpose in the mundane. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. At 42, Marcus carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed almost out of place, pushing a janitor's cart through the corridors where his 8-year-old daughter Emma spent her days. The irony wasn't lost on him, cleaning the same floor she walked, emptying the trash cans near her classroom, ensuring the bathrooms she used sparkled with a care that went beyond mere employment. It was love disguised as labor, devotion dressed in navy blue coveralls. The September evening air drifted through the propped-open doors, carrying with it the promise of another Chicago autumn. Marcus paused in his work, allowing himself a moment to breathe in the familiar mixture of cooling concrete and distant pizza from Tony's across the street. These were the hours he treasured most, when the building belonged to him alone, when he could work without the curious glances of parents who wondered why a man his age was content with such simple work. "Evening, Marcus," came a voice from the main entrance. Principal Janet Rodriguez stepped through the doorway, her heels clicking against the freshly mopped tiles with the careful precision of someone who understood the effort that went into their shine. She was one of the few who saw beyond his uniform, who noticed the way Emma's face lit up when she spotted her father's work cart in the hallway. "Evening, Mrs. Rodriguez, just finishing up the West Wing." His voice carried the weight of genuine respect, tinged with the slight hoarseness that came from years of keeping his own counsel. "Emma mentioned you helped her with her math homework during lunch yesterday." "Thank you for that," Janet smiled, adjusting the stack of papers in her arms. "That girl of yours is something special, Marcus. Brightest third grader I've seen in 15 years of teaching. The way she explained fractions to Tommy Martinez today, she has your patience and your heart." The compliment settled over Marcus like a warm blanket, even as it stirred something deeper, a bittersweet recognition of qualities he'd once used in entirely different circumstances. "She gets that from her mother," he replied quietly, returning to his mop with renewed focus. "Sarah always could make the complicated seem simple. How long has it been now?" Janet asked gently, understanding the careful way grief lived in the spaces between ordinary conversations. 4 years this December." The answer came without hesitation, but carried within it the weight of every sleepless night, every missed school event due to work, every moment he'd wondered if his love alone was enough to raise a daughter who deserved the world. "Cancer doesn't care about timing, does it? Took her right when Emma needed her mother most." Janet nodded, recognizing the familiar territory of loss that so many of her families navigated. "And yet Emma radiates happiness, Marcus. Whatever you're doing, it's working. She talks about you constantly, how you help with her projects, how you make pancakes shaped like animals on Sundays, how you sing old songs while you do the dishes." A genuine smile crossed Marcus's face, transforming the tired lines around his eyes into something approaching joy. "She loves those Sunday mornings. Says my pancake elephants look more like lopsided cars, but she eats them anyway." He paused, leaning against the mop handle. "Sometimes I worry it's not enough, just me and her against the world. She needs stability, needs to know she's safe, that someone's got her back no matter what. Children need love more than they need perfection," Janet observed, her voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent watching families in all their beautiful, messy configurations. "And that little girl knows she's loved beyond measure." The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of Carlos Mendoza's vacuum starting up in the gymnasium. Carlos, the evening custodial supervisor, had been Marcus's closest friend since he'd started at Jefferson. A 60-year-old grandfather of 5 who wore his Puerto Rican heritage. with pride and dispensed advice with the gentle authority of someone who'd seen every possible human struggle play out in the hallways of public education. Carlos working late again, Janet noted, gathering her papers more securely. That man's dedication puts us all to shame, Marcus chuckled, the sound carrying genuine warmth. He's training his grandson Miguel to take over some of his roots. Says the boy needs to understand the dignity and honest work before college spoils him with big dreams. The vacuum grew louder as Carlos moved closer to their section of the building, and Marcus could hear him humming an old salsa tune, the melody drifting through the air like a bridge between the day's end and night's beginning. "Speaking of dignity," Janet said, her tone shifting slightly toward the administrative, "I wanted to mention that Emma's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, has noticed some interesting things in Emma's writing assignments lately." Marcus felt his chest tighten, almost imperceptibly. "What kind of things?" "Stories about heroes, mostly. But not the usual superhero fantasy stuff 8-year-olds typically write. These are detailed, almost informed pieces about soldiers, about sacrifice, about what it means to serve something bigger than yourself." Janet's expression grew thoughtful. "She wrote one last week about a soldier who saved his whole unit, but never told anyone about it afterward. Very mature themes for a third grader." The mop handle grew slippery in Marcus's suddenly damp palms. "She's got a good imagination. Probably picked up some of those ideas from movies or books." "Maybe," Janet agreed, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "It's just that the details are so specific, so emotionally accurate. And yesterday, when we had that Veterans Day assembly planning meeting, Emma raised her hand and asked why some heroes never get recognized, why some people do important things but never talk about them." The fluorescent light above them flickered again, casting the hallway in brief darkness before humming back to life. In that moment of shadow, Marcus felt the familiar weight of memories he'd worked so hard to keep buried. "Kids ask complicated questions sometimes," he managed, his voice carefully neutral. "They do," Janet agreed. "And Emma seems to have inherited your way of seeing the world, looking deeper than the surface, caring about things that matter." She shifted her papers again, a gesture that suggested she was preparing to leave, but also that there was more she wanted to say. "Marcus, I hope you know that if you ever need anything at all, this school, this community, we're here for you and Emma. You're not as alone as you sometimes seem to think you are." The kindness in her voice nearly undid something in Marcus's carefully constructed composure. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Rodriguez, more than you know." After she left, the building settled into its evening quiet, broken only by the distant hum of Carlos's vacuum and the occasional creak of settling wood and metal. Marcus returned to his work, but Janet's words echoed in his mind, mixing with older echoes, older voices speaking of duty and sacrifice and the weight of choices that define a life. The janitor's closet on the second floor had become Marcus's sanctuary over the past 3 years, a space where he kept not just cleaning supplies, but also the small comforts that made the long nights bearable. A thermos of coffee that Emma had helped him pack that morning, still warm and smelling of the vanilla creamer she insisted on adding. A paperback novel, spine cracked from multiple readings, that he'd picked up at the used bookstore on Ashland Avenue, and tucked beneath a stack of inventory sheets, a single photograph of Emma on her first day of school, gap-toothed smile radiant beneath the backpack that had seemed enormous on her small frame. As he reached for fresh paper towels from the top shelf, his elbow knocked against a cardboard box that had been pushed far into the corner. The box shifted, tipping forward, and its contents spilled across the narrow floor of the closet with a metallic clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet building. Marcus froze, staring down at the scattered objects with an expression of someone who had just seen a ghost walk through the wall. Medals, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Infantry, badge, Silver Star, each piece of metal and ribbon carried with it the weight of memories he'd thought he'd successfully buried beneath. 3 years of routine and responsibility. His hands shook as he knelt to gather them, muscle memory guiding his fingers to arrange them in proper order, even as his mind reeled with the implications of their discovery. These weren't supposed to be here. These belonged to a different life, a different version of himself that he'd left behind in the mountains of Afghanistan, along with everything else that had once defined him. The bronze star felt heavier than he remembered, its weight disproportionate to its size as he turned it over in his palm. The citation flashed through his memory with unwelcome clarity for heroic achievement in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. The words felt foreign now, like they described someone else entirely, someone who existed before Emma needed him to be simply and completely her father. Standing slowly, Marcus looked around the small closet with new eyes. How had these ended up here? He'd been so careful, so thorough in his efforts to leave that part of his life sealed away. The only explanation was that they'd been in his work jacket, the same jacket he'd worn on his last day in the army, the same jacket he'd hastily packed when he'd moved to Chicago to start over, to become the father Emma needed instead of the soldier the army had made him. The Purple Heart caught the fluorescent light differently than the others, its purple and gold ribbon somehow more vivid against his palm. 3 separate wounds, 3 separate acts of what the military called valor, but what had felt in the moment like simply doing whatever was necessary to bring his soldiers home alive. The shrapnel scars on his left shoulder and thigh had faded to thin white lines over the years, but the emotional weight of those moments remained as fresh as the day they'd happened. Carlos's humming grew closer, his voice carrying a Spanish lullaby that his grandmother used to sing. The sound pulled Marcus back to the present, back to the reality of his situation. If Carlos found him here, surrounded by these remnants of his former life, questions would be asked. Questions that would lead to conversations that would inevitably reach Emma. And Emma's carefully constructed world of stability and normalcy would crack open to reveal complexities she was too young to understand. Moving with practiced quiet, Marcus gathered the medals and pushed them deep into the cardboard box, shoving it back into the corner of the closet with perhaps more force than necessary. But even as he tried to hide the physical evidence of his past, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. These medals had been discovered once. Who was to say they wouldn't be discovered again? The rest of his shift passed in a haze of routine tasks performed with distracted efficiency. Empty trash cans, mop floors, wipe down surfaces, lock doors. Each action required no conscious thought, allowing his mind to drift between past and present, between the man he'd been and the father he'd chosen to become. By the time his shift ended at midnight, the autumn air had grown sharp with the promise of winter's approach. Marcus walked the 8 blocks to his apartment building with his collar turned up against the wind, the weight of his discovery making each step feel heavier than usual. The medals might be hidden again, but their brief return to light had stirred something he couldn't easily push back into darkness. The apartment he shared with Emma was on the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone. 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that barely qualified as such, but it was clean and warm and filled with the evidence of their shared life. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator in layers of colorful chaos. Her backpack sat ready by the door for the morning, and the faint scent of the bedtime story they'd shared hours earlier still lingered in the air. Marcus stood in the doorway of Emma's room, watching her sleep in the glow of the nightlight that cast dancing horses across the ceiling. She slept with the complete abandon of childhood, one arm flung across her pillow, the other clutching the stuffed elephant he'd bought her on her 7th birthday. In sleep, she looked so much like Sarah that Marcus sometimes had to catch his breath, had to remind himself that grief was love with nowhere to go, and that Emma carried the best of both her parents forward into whatever future awaited them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and small joys. Breakfast together before school, Emma's excited chatter about whatever project her class was working on, the comfortable routine of their evening ritual of homework and dinner and stories. But tonight, Standing in the darkness of his small apartment, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed world was about to change in ways he couldn't control or predict. The medals were just pieces of metal and ribbon, after all, but they represented recognition of actions that had once defined him, had once been the most important things he'd ever done. And now, years later, as he struggled to be the father Emma deserved, Marcus found himself wondering whether the man who'd earned those medals and the man who made elephant-shaped pancakes on Sunday mornings could ever truly coexist. Outside, Chicago settled into its midnight rhythm, and somewhere in the darkness, between sleep and waking, Marcus Thompson began to understand that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of finding their way back to the light. The alarm clock's mechanical shriek cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 5:30 a.m., just as it had every weekday for the past 3 years. Marcus's hand found the snooze button with the practiced precision of someone whose body had learned to function on exactly 4.5 hours of sleep. The apartment around him lay wrapped in that particular stillness that belongs to the hours before the world wakes up, a quiet so complete that he could hear Emma's steady breathing through the thin wall that separated their bedrooms. Rolling onto his back, Marcus stared at the ceiling, where the streetlight outside painted shifting patterns through the blinds. His shoulder ached with the dull persistence that always accompanied changes in weather, a souvenir from Kandahar that served as a more reliable barometer than any forecast. The discovery of those medals 12 hours earlier sat in his chest like undigested food, a weight that made even the simple act of rising feel more complicated than it should. The morning routine unfolded with clockwork efficiency born of necessity. You shower, quick and quiet to avoid waking Emma. Coffee, strong enough to substitute for the sleep he never seemed to get enough of. Check Emma's backpack, homework completed, lunch money counted twice, permission slip for next week's field trip signed and tucked safely in the front pocket. Every action performed with the meticulous care of someone who understood that small oversights could cascade into larger problems when you were parenting without a safety net. By 6:15, Marcus was standing over the stove, spatula in hand, watching pancake batter bubble and transform on the griddle. This was the part of his day that felt most like prayer, not the formal kind his grandmother had insisted on during his childhood in rural Alabama, but something deeper and more personal. The simple act of preparing food for his daughter carried within it all the love and protection and hope he couldn't always find words to express. "Daddy?" Emma's voice drifted from the doorway, thick with sleep and still slightly hoarse from yesterday's playground adventures. She appeared in the kitchen wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with the carousel horses that were now too small, but which she refused to abandon, her dark hair forming a corona of tangles that would require patient attention before school. "Morning, baby girl," Marcus's voice softened automatically, the way it always did when she entered a room, as if her presence activated some gentler version of himself. Perfect timing. First batch is almost ready. Emma climbed onto her designated stool at the kitchen counter, immediately launching into the stream of consciousness commentary that served as her morning warm-up. "Mrs. Patterson says we're going to start learning about the solar system next week. And I want to do my project on Jupiter because it has the biggest storm in the whole universe, and it's been going for hundreds of years, which is like way longer than America has even existed and did. You know that if you fell into Jupiter, you wouldn't land on anything because it's just gas all the way down." Marcus flipped the pancakes with the satisfied precision of someone who had mastered this particular domestic art through pure repetition. "I did not know that about Jupiter. Sounds like it would be a pretty scary place to visit, yeah. But also kind of cool, because imagine falling forever, and ever and never hitting the ground." Emma's eyes lit up with the particular enthusiasm she reserved for concepts that pushed against the boundaries of her understanding. It would be like flying, except backwards, and probably not as fun, because you'd run out of air and die. The matter-of-fact way she discussed mortality never failed to catch Marcus off guard. At 8, Emma possessed a clarity about life's harder truths that sometimes seemed older than her years, a quality he recognized as both gift and burden. Sarah had been the same way, able to look directly at difficult things without flinching, to find wonder even in the face of uncertainty. Elephant or dinosaur? Marcus asked, holding up the spatula with ceremonial gravity. Elephant today, but make sure the ears are really big, because yesterday's elephant looked more like a deformed cow. Emma giggled at her own assessment, and the sound filled the small kitchen with the kind of joy that made Marcus understand why people wrote songs about ordinary morning moments. As he worked to create pancake ears of appropriately elephantine proportions, Marcus found his thoughts drifting back to the medals hidden in that cardboard box. The Bronze Star had been awarded for a night in October 2009, when his unit had been pinned down by insurgent fire in a valley that intelligence had assured them was clear. 3 soldiers wounded, extraction 20 minutes away, and Marcus had made the decision to cross 50 yards of open ground under enemy fire to establish a medical position that would keep them alive until help arrived. He'd been 28 then, young enough to believe in clear distinctions between right and wrong, brave and cowardly, hero and coward. The military had ways of categorizing actions, of distilling complex moments of terror and determination into neat summaries suitable for official records. But standing in his kitchen 7 years later, watching his daughter's face light up over breakfast, Marcus understood that the man who'd earned those medals and the father who worried about permission slips existed in entirely different universes of meaning. "Daddy, are you okay?" Emma's voice carried a note of concern that pierced through his reverie. "You look sad." The observation hit him with unexpected force, not because it was inaccurate, but because Emma had always possessed an unsettling ability to read his emotional weather with the precision of someone much older. It was a trait that both amazed and worried him, this capacity she had for seeing beyond whatever mask he thought he was wearing. "Just thinking about work, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." Marcus set the plate in front of her with a flourish, complete with elephant pancake, sporting ears that were admittedly quite impressive in their size and definition. "What do you think? Worthy of the African savannah?" Emma examined her breakfast with the serious attention of a food critic, tilting her head at various angles before delivering her verdict. "The ears are perfect, but I think his trunk is a little short. Maybe more like a baby elephant than a grown-up one." "Baby elephants are still elephants," Marcus replied, settling onto the stool beside her with his own more conventionally shaped pancakes. "And sometimes the young ones are the bravest of all." They ate in companionable quiet for several minutes, the morning light growing stronger outside their kitchen window and beginning to paint the fire escape in shades of gold and amber. This was Marcus's favorite time of day, before the world imposed its demands on both of them, when they could exist in the bubble of their shared life without reference to anything beyond these walls. "Daddy!" Emma's voice carried that particular intonation she used when preparing to ask something important. "What does heroic mean?" The question landed with the impact of something much heavier than a simple vocabulary inquiry. Marcus set down his fork, buying himself time by taking a sip of coffee that had already grown lukewarm. "Why do you ask, baby girl?" Mrs. Patterson used it yesterday when she was talking about firefighters and police officers and soldiers. She said they do heroic things to keep people safe. But then Tommy Martinez said his uncle is a soldier and he's not heroic. He's just normal. And Mrs. Patterson got that look she gets when someone says something that's not exactly wrong but not exactly right either. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Emma's questions ventured into territory he'd hoped to keep unexplored. For a few more years. "What do you think it means?" "I think," Emma paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. I think maybe it means doing something really hard or scary because it's the right thing to do, even when you don't want to do it. Like when you went to that parent-teacher conference, even though you were so tired, you could barely keep your eyes open. Because you wanted to make sure I was doing okay in school. The simplicity of her definition and the example she chose made something shift in Marcus's chest. Here he was, wrestling with the weight of official recognition for actions he'd taken in wartime, while his 8-year-old daughter saw heroism in the everyday sacrifices he made without thinking about them at all. That's a very good definition. Emma, I think heroes are people who do what needs to be done, even when it's difficult, because they care about something or someone more than they care about their own comfort. Emma nodded sagely, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. So, Mrs. Patterson is kind of heroic because she stays late to help kids who are struggling with reading, even though she probably wants to go home and watch TV like normal people do at the end of the day, exactly like that. And Carlos is heroic because he works really hard to keep our school clean and safe, even though some of the bigger kids are mean to him sometimes and call him names in Spanish that they think he doesn't understand. Marcus felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. Emma's ability to see the dignity in work that others might dismiss was a quality he cherished, but her awareness of the casual cruelty that existed in her world was a burden he wished he could spare her. Carlos is definitely heroic in his own way. He takes care of all of you kids, makes sure you have a clean, safe place to learn. Are you heroic, Daddy? The question came without preamble, delivered with the directness that only children could manage. Marcus felt the weight of those hidden medals pressing against his consciousness like a physical presence. How could he answer honestly without revealing truths she wasn't ready to hear? How could he lie without undermining everything he'd tried to teach her about integrity and authenticity? I try to be heroic for you, he said finally, settling on words that felt true without being complete. Every day I try to make choices that will keep you safe and happy and help you grow up to be the amazing person I already know you are. That's the most important heroic thing I can think of doing. Emma seemed satisfied with this answer, returning to her elephant pancake with renewed enthusiasm. But Marcus could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, the way they always did when she was processing information that didn't quite fit into her existing understanding of the world. The walk to Jefferson Elementary took exactly 12 minutes at Emma's preferred pace, which included stops to examine interesting leaves, to pet Mrs. Chen's ancient golden retriever who held court on the corner of Maple and 3rd, and to count the number of yellow cars they passed along the way. It was a ritual that had evolved over 3 years of shared mornings, as predictable and comforting as anything in their carefully structured life. Daddy? Emma's voice carried that familiar note of impending significance. If someone did something really brave and important, but then never told anyone about it, would it still count as being heroic? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because he hadn't expected it eventually, but because Emma's timing was always uncannily perfect in its ability to catch him off guard. They were stopped at the crosswalk just 2 blocks from school, surrounded by other parent-child pairs engaged in their own morning conversations, and Marcus found himself struggling to formulate an answer that wouldn't betray more than he was ready to reveal. What makes you ask that, sweetheart? I was thinking about it after our conversation at breakfast. Like if Mrs. Patterson helped a kid learn to read but never told anyone about it, would that make her less heroic than if she told everyone? Or what if someone saved a bunch of people, but then moved somewhere else and got a different job and never talked about the saving they did? The specificity of her hypothetical scenarios made Marcus's pulse quicken. Emma had always been observant, always been quick to notice patterns and connections that escaped other children her age. But this felt different, more focused, as if she were working towards some larger understanding that existed just beyond his ability to predict or control. I think, Marcus said carefully, That the most heroic people don't do heroic things because they want recognition. They do them because something inside them can't do anything else. So whether people know about it or not doesn't change the essential fact of what they did. Emma nodded thoughtfully, her small hand secure in his as they crossed the street toward the familiar red brick building where she spent her days learning about fractions and Jupiter and the solar system. That makes sense. Like how you do nice things for people all the time, but you never make a big deal about it. What nice things? Marcus asked, genuinely curious about how his actions appeared through Emma's eyes. Like how you always make sure the bathrooms at school are extra clean on days when there's a big assembly. Because, lots of parents will be there and you want them to think well of our school. Or how you leave little encouraging notes in Carlos's locker when he's having a hard week. Or how you volunteer to stay late when there's a special event. Even though you've already worked all day and you're tired, each example felt like a small revelation. Evidence of how closely Emma observed not just his actions, but his motivations. Marcus had thought he was being discreet in these gestures, these small attempts to make life better for the people around him. To learn that Emma had not only noticed but understood their significance was both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. "I didn't know you paid such close attention to what I do at work," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "I pay attention to everything about you. Daddy, you're the most important person in my whole world, so of course I notice things." Emma's matter-of-fact delivery of this profound statement made Marcus's chest tighten with an emotion that was part gratitude, part terror, part absolute determination to be worthy of such complete trust. They reached the school's front entrance, where Principal Rodriguez stood greeting students and parents with the warm efficiency that had made Jefferson Elementary feel like an extension of family rather than simply an institution. Her smile when she spotted Emma was genuine and specific, the kind of recognition that every child deserved, but not every child received. "Good morning, Emma. Ready for another day of conquering the universe?" Emma giggled, releasing Marcus's hand to skip up the steps toward her classroom. "We're starting our solar system unit today, so technically, yes, I am ready to conquer the universe. Or at least understand it better, which is probably more realistic." Marcus watched his daughter disappear into the stream of other children, her backpack bouncing against her narrow shoulders, her voice already raised in animated conversation with a cluster of classmates. This moment, watching her walk confidently into her own life, never failed to fill him with a complex mixture of pride and loss, satisfaction and worry. She's something special. "That one," Principal Rodriguez observed, joining Marcus on the sidewalk as the crowd of parents and children dispersed toward their respective days. "She is. Sometimes I wonder if she's too observant for her own good, sees things other kids her age might miss." Intelligence is never a burden, Marcus, though it can sometimes feel like one. Emma's got a rare combination of intellectual curiosity and emotional wisdom. She asks the kind of questions that make adults examine their own assumptions. Marcus felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the sense that Emma's questions were indeed leading somewhere he wasn't prepared to follow. "She's been asking about heroes lately. What makes someone heroic, whether recognition matters, that sort of thing." Principal Rodriguez's expression grew thoughtful. The eternal questions. "We had a discussion in our last staff meeting about how to approach the upcoming Veterans Day assembly, how to talk about service and sacrifice in ways that 8-year-olds can understand. It's tricky territory, honoring the very real sacrifices people have made while not glorifying violence or making civilian life seem less valuable by comparison." This mention of Veterans Day sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the October morning air. He'd managed to avoid the previous 2 years' assemblies by claiming work obligations, but this year Emma had already mentioned her excitement about the special program multiple times. The thought of sitting in that gymnasium, surrounded by other parents, while children sang patriotic songs and local veterans shared sanitized stories about their service, made his palms sweat with anticipation of exposure. "How do you plan to approach it this year?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "We're focusing on the concept of service in all its forms. Military, yes, but also teachers, firefighters, medical workers, even parents who sacrifice their own dreams to give their children better opportunities. The idea is to help kids understand that heroism comes in many forms, not all of them involving uniforms or medals. The word medals hung in the air between them like a loaded gun, and Marcus fought the urge to look away from Principal Rodriguez's casual gaze. She couldn't possibly know about his discovery the night before, couldn't possibly suspect that he was exactly the kind of veteran they'd want to parade in front of the children as an example of service and sacrifice. But her timing felt ominous nonetheless, as if the universe were conspiring to force conversations he wasn't ready to have. "That sounds like a thoughtful approach," Marcus managed, already calculating how he might arrange to be unavoidably absent on the day of the assembly. "Would you be interested in participating?" Principal Rodriguez's question landed with the impact of something much heavier than a simple invitation. Not necessarily speaking to the children, but maybe helping with setup or cleanup. Emma would be so proud to see her father involved in the school community in that way. The offer was kindly meant, Marcus recognized, but it felt like a trap nonetheless. How could he explain that his involvement in any Veterans Day event would require revelations he wasn't prepared to make? How could he admit that the man Emma knew as her devoted, gentle father was the same person who'd once called in airstrikes and made life-and-death decisions in the mountains of Afghanistan? "I'll think about it," Marcus replied, knowing even as he spoke that he would spend the next few weeks searching for reasons to decline without seeming ungrateful or suspicious. The remainder of his day unfolded with the familiar rhythm of routine maintenance and invisible service. Empty classrooms to clean, floors to mop, supplies to inventory and restock. But the discovery of those medals had changed something fundamental about how he moved through these spaces. Where once he'd found peace in the predictable nature of his work, now he felt hyper-aware of every conversation, every glance, every casual mention of military service or Veterans Day or heroism. During his lunch break, Marcus found himself in the custodial office, sharing reheated leftovers with Carlos, while the older man regaled him with stories about his grandson's latest academic achievements. Miguel was a senior in high school now, already accepted to 3 different colleges, and Carlos's pride in the boy's accomplishments was infectious. "That kid's going to be the first one in our family to get a degree," Carlos said, unwrapping a sandwich that smelled like his wife's legendary pulled pork. "Sometimes I can't believe he came from the same gene pool as the rest of us knuckleheads." Marcus smiled, genuinely happy for his friend's family success. "You should be proud, Carlos. You and Maria raised him right. We tried. But mostly, we just tried to stay out of his way and let him be smarter than us." Carlos took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. "You know what I told him yesterday? I said, 'Miguel, you're going to go out into the world and do amazing things, but don't ever forget that there's dignity in all kinds of work. Don't ever look down on the people who clean your offices or serve your food or fix your car. Some of the best people I know, the most honest and hard-working and decent people, are the ones nobody pays attention to.'" The observation hit closer to home than Carlos could have known. Marcus had spent the last 3 years finding his identity in exactly that kind of invisible service, in work that mattered precisely because it was unglamorous and unrecognized. But now, with those medals sitting like guilty secrets in the back of his mind, he wondered whether he'd been hiding from something important or protecting something precious. "Emma asked me about heroes this morning," Marcus said, surprising himself with the admission. "Wanted to know what makes someone heroic." Carlos nodded sagely. "Kids ask the hard questions, don't they?" "What did you tell her?" "That heroes do what needs to be done because they care about something more than their own comfort." "But I'm not sure that's the whole truth. What's the rest of it?" Marcus hesitated, then decided that if he was going to talk to anyone about this, Carlos was probably the safest choice. The older man had a way of listening without judgment, of offering perspective without pushing for details that weren't freely given. I think sometimes heroes are just people who found themselves in situations where all the choices were terrible, and they picked the one that let them live with themselves afterward. Not because they were brave or noble, but because something in them couldn't do anything else. Carlos studied him with the careful attention he usually reserved for mechanical problems that required patient diagnosis. That sounds like wisdom that comes from more than just theory. My friend, it was as close as Carlos had ever come to directly asking about Marcus's past. And for a moment, Marcus felt the weight of 3 years' worth of careful omissions pressing against his chest like a physical presence. Part of him wanted to confess everything: the medals, the missions, the weight of actions that had earned him recognition he'd never felt comfortable accepting. But another part of him, the larger part, recoiled from the idea of complicating the simple friendship they'd built around shared work and mutual respect. "Just thinking out loud," Marcus said finally, returning to his sandwich with perhaps more focus than it required. Carlos nodded, accepting the deflection with the gracious understanding that had made him such a valuable friend over the past 3 years. But Marcus could feel the older man's thoughtful gaze lingering on him, could sense that Carlos's curiosity had been piqued in ways that might prove complicated as the weeks progressed. The afternoon passed in a blur of familiar tasks made strange by the weight of unspoken truths. Every time Marcus passed the janitor's closet, where those medals lay hidden, he felt their presence like a magnetic pull, drawing his attention away from the work at hand. By the time Emma's school day ended, he had mopped the same section of hallway twice and reorganized the supply closet 3 times, his nervous energy seeking outlet in repetitive action. Emma bounced down the front steps of Jefferson Elementary with the particular enthusiasm she reserved for days when something exciting had happened in class. Her backpack bulged with projects and worksheets, and her face carried the satisfied glow of someone who had successfully navigated another day of 3rd-grade challenges. "Daddy, guess what we learned about Jupiter today?" She launched into an immediate recap of the day's astronomical discoveries, her words tumbling over each other in her excitement to share every detail. "Mrs. Patterson showed us pictures from NASA, and Jupiter's great red spot is actually a storm that's bigger than the whole Earth, and it's been going for like 400 years, which means it started before America was even a country." And Marcus listened with the practiced attention of someone who understood that Emma's need to process her day through storytelling was as essential as breathing. They walked home through the familiar neighborhood streets, past the corner market where Mr. Kim always waved from behind his register, past the community garden where Emma liked to count the different types of flowers, past the small playground where she'd learned to swing and climb and navigate the complex social dynamics of childhood friendships. And then Tommy Martinez said something really interesting. Emma continued, her tone shifting to the more serious register she used when approaching topics that puzzled her. He said his uncle, who's a soldier, told him that being in the army isn't like in movies, that mostly it's boring, and you spend a lot of time cleaning equipment and doing paperwork and waiting around for things to happen. Marcus felt his steps slow, almost imperceptibly. What made Tommy bring that up? "We were talking about the Veterans Day assembly, and Mrs. Patterson asked if anyone had family members who had served in the military." Tommy raised his hand and started talking about his uncle. But then he got this weird look on his face and said his uncle doesn't like talking about being a soldier, that he gets uncomfortable when people ask him about it. The conversation was heading into territory that made Marcus's chest tighten with familiar anxiety. "Some people prefer to keep certain parts of their lives private, sweetheart. That doesn't mean those parts aren't important, just that they're personal." Emma nodded thoughtfully, her 8-year-old mind working to process concepts that most adults struggle to understand. "Like how you don't really talk about what you did before we moved to Chicago. I know you had other jobs before you worked at my school, but you never tell stories about them the way Carlos tells stories about working at the factory." The observation was delivered with Emma's characteristic directness, without accusation or demand, simply as a statement of fact that she'd noticed and catalogued among all the other details she collected about her father's life. But it landed with the force of something much heavier, a reminder that Emma's powers of observation extended far beyond what Marcus had realized. "That's right," Marcus said carefully. "Some experiences are harder to talk about than others. That doesn't mean they weren't important, just that they require more processing before they're ready to be shared. Is that why you sometimes get that sad look when people talk about soldiers, or when we watch movies with army guys in them? Like you're remembering something that hurts?" The question stopped Marcus in his tracks, literally and figuratively. He stood on the sidewalk outside their apartment building, staring down at his daughter's upturned face, and realized that his carefully constructed walls of privacy had been far more transparent than he'd imagined. Emma had been watching, noticing, cataloging his reactions for 3 years, building her own understanding of the parts of his life he'd thought he was successfully keeping hidden. "You're very observant, Emma," he said finally, crouching down so they were at eye level. "And yes, sometimes when people talk about military service, I think about difficult things. Things that happened before you were born, before we came to Chicago." Emma studied his face with the serious attention she usually reserved for particularly challenging math problems. "Were you a soldier, Daddy?" The question hung in the air between them, like a bridge Marcus could either cross or burn. He'd known this moment would come eventually, had rehearsed various versions of this conversation in his mind countless times over the past 3 years, but the reality of it felt entirely different from any scenario he'd imagined. Here, on the sidewalk outside their building, with Emma looking at him with such complete trust and curiosity, the weight of 3 years' worth of careful omissions pressed against his chest like a physical presence. "Yes," he said simply. "I was a soldier for 12 years before you and I moved here." Emma's expression shifted through several stages. Surprise, understanding, then a kind of satisfied recognition, as if this revelation confirmed something she'd suspected all along. "I knew it," she said with the particular triumph that comes from having a theory proven correct. "I mean, I didn't know for sure, but there were clues." "What kind of clues?" "The way you stand sometimes. Really straight and still, like you're waiting for someone to tell you what to do. The way you always check all the doors and windows before we go to bed, like you're making sure we're safe from something specific. The way you know things about maps and first aid, and how to fix things that most dads don't know." Emma paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. "And sometimes when you think I'm not looking, you get this expression like you're somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that wasn't very nice." Each observation felt like a small revelation. Evidence of how closely Emma had been watching, how much she'd understood without being told. Marcus felt a mixture of pride in her perceptiveness and concern about what else she might have noticed that he'd thought he was successfully concealing. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Emma asked, her tone carrying curiosity rather than accusation. Marcus settled onto the front steps of their building, patting the concrete beside him until Emma joined him. The afternoon air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant promise of winter, and for a moment he allowed himself to simply exist in this in-between space, no longer hiding but not yet fully revealed. "Because when I stopped being a soldier and became your daddy, I wanted to focus completely on that job. Being your father is the most important thing I've ever done, Emma. More important than anything I did in the army. I didn't want old memories to get in the way of being the parent you deserved." Emma leaned against his shoulder, her small warmth a comfort he hadn't realized he needed. "But those old memories are still part of you, aren't they? Like you can't just decide not to be someone you used to be." The wisdom in her simple statement made Marcus's throat tighten with emotion. Here was his 8-year-old daughter, articulating something he'd been struggling to understand for 3 years. The impossibility of completely separating past selves from present identity. The way experience layered upon experience to create the complex reality of who someone actually was. "You're right," he admitted. "Those memories are still part of me. I think I was hoping that if I focused hard enough on being your daddy, the soldier part would just fade away, but it doesn't work like that, does it?" "Nothing ever really goes away completely," Emma said, with the matter-of-fact wisdom that sometimes made her seem older than her years. "Like when Mommy died, you thought maybe if we moved to a new place and started over, it wouldn't hurt as much. But she's still with us, just in a different way. The sad is still there, but so is all the love and the good memories." Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by his daughter's capacity to understand concepts that had taken him years to accept. "When did you get so wise, baby girl?" "I've been practicing," Emma said solemnly, then broke into a grin that transformed her entire face. "Plus, I pay attention to everything, remember? I'm like a detective, except instead of solving crimes, I solve the mystery of why my daddy sometimes looks like he's carrying invisible heavy things." The metaphor was so accurate, it took Marcus's breath away. He'd been carrying invisible heavy things, the weight of actions taken and decisions made, the responsibility of lives saved and lost, the complicated legacy of service that felt both essential to who he was and impossible to reconcile with the gentle father he'd tried to become. "Do you want to know more about the soldier part?" Marcus asked, surprised by his own willingness to open this door wider. Emma considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I want to know whatever you want to tell me, but only if talking about it won't make you more sad than you already are." The condition she placed on her curiosity, that his emotional well-being mattered more than her desire for information, made Marcus understand once again why Emma was the most precious thing in his world. At 8 years old, she possessed an emotional intelligence that many adults never developed, an intuitive understanding of how to care for the people she loved. "It might make me sad to talk about some of it," Marcus said honestly, "but keeping it secret has been making me sad too. Maybe it's time to try something different." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the afternoon light shift across the familiar landscape of their neighborhood. Other families moved through their own end-of-day routines, children being called in for dinner, parents returning from work, the small domestic dramas that made up the fabric of ordinary life. Marcus felt a deep gratitude for the normalcy they'd built together, even as he recognized that their understanding of what constituted their normal was about to shift. "Can I ask you something else?" Emma's voice carried that particular note she used when approaching territory she wasn't sure was safe to explore. "Anything. When you were a soldier, were you one of the heroic ones? Like the kind we learned about in social studies, who did brave things to help other people?" The question landed with all the complexity Marcus had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. How could he explain the ambiguous nature of military service to someone who still saw the world in terms of clear moral categories? How could he convey the weight of recognition he'd received without either glorifying violence or diminishing the genuine sacrifice of those who hadn't made it home? "I did my job," Marcus said carefully. "Sometimes that job involved making difficult decisions in dangerous situations. Other people thought some of those decisions were noteworthy, but I always just thought of it as doing what needed to be done to take care of the soldiers I was responsible for." Emma nodded, processing this information with the careful attention she brought to all new concepts. "Like how you take care of me, except with grown-ups who were also in danger." The parallel she drew was both accurate and oversimplified, but Marcus recognized it as a starting point for understanding rather than a complete explanation. "Something like that, yes. Did you get medals?" The question was asked with the casual directness that only children could manage, as if she were asking about his favorite color or what he'd had for lunch. Marcus felt the weight of those hidden awards pressing against his consciousness like a physical presence. The moment had arrived, not in the way he'd planned or prepared for, but with the inevitable force of water finding its own level. He could continue the careful dance of partial truths and gentle omissions, or he could trust that Emma's love for him was strong enough to accommodate the complexity of who he'd been before he became her father. "Yes," he said simply. "I got medals." Emma's eyes widened slightly, but her expression remained curious rather than shocked. "Important ones?" "According to the army, yes. Important ones. Where are they?" The question he'd been dreading arrived with characteristic Emma-like efficiency. "Hidden away. I haven't looked at them in a long time. Why do you hide them? If you did heroic things and people wanted to recognize that, why wouldn't you want to remember?" Marcus struggled to find words that would make sense to someone who hadn't experienced the complicated aftermath of recognition for actions taken in extremity. "Because those medals represent some of the hardest days of my life, Emma. Days when people I cared about were hurt or killed. Days when I had to make choices that still keep me awake sometimes. The medals are supposed to honor what I did, but when I look at them, mostly I just remember what it cost." Emma leaned more heavily against his shoulder, her small hand finding his larger one and squeezing gently. "That sounds really sad, Daddy." "It is sad sometimes. But it's also complicated, because those experiences, even the hard ones, made me who I am. And who I am is Emma Thompson's daddy, which is the best job I've ever had." They remained on the steps as the afternoon light continued to shift and change around them, neither ready to go inside and resume their normal evening routine. Marcus felt as if they'd crossed some invisible threshold, as if their relationship had shifted into new territory that would require careful navigation in the days and weeks ahead. "Daddy?" Emma's voice was thoughtful, carrying the weight of someone working through a complex problem. "I think maybe the medals aren't really about you being heroic. I think they're about other people saying thank you for taking care of them when they couldn't take care of themselves." The insight was so profound, so precisely accurate, that Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. Here was his 8-year-old daughter, articulating something he'd struggled to understand for years, that recognition wasn't necessarily about the person receiving it, but about the people giving it. Their need to acknowledge sacrifice and service, and the complex web of obligation that bound communities together. "I think you might be right about that," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't entirely sure how to process. "So maybe," Emma continued, her logic building with the same methodical precision she brought to her math homework, "maybe the reason you hide them isn't because you don't deserve them, but because you don't want to have to explain to people what it cost you to earn them." Marcus felt tears he'd been holding back for 3 years finally slip down his cheeks, overwhelmed by his daughter's capacity to see straight to the heart of truths he'd been circling around without ever quite reaching. "Emma, how did you get so smart about feelings?" "I had a good teacher," she said simply, squeezing his hand again. "You taught me that taking care of people is the most important thing we can do, even when it's hard. You just forgot that you were allowed to be taken care of, too." The Veterans Day Assembly announcement appeared on the Jefferson Elementary bulletin board 3 weeks later, printed on patriotic letterhead and positioned where every parent dropping off or picking up their children couldn't help but notice it. Marcus spotted it on a Tuesday morning while waiting for Emma to gather her forgotten science project from her locker, and the sight of it made his stomach clench with the familiar anxiety that had been building since his conversation with Principal. "Rodriguez, Special Community Recognition Ceremony," the heading proclaimed in bold red letters. "Jefferson Elementary proudly invites all families to join us in honoring the service members in our community. Local veterans will share their experiences, and we'll present special recognition to those who have served our nation with distinction." The word recognition seemed to pulse on the page like a neon sign, and Marcus found himself wondering if this was coincidence or if somehow, impossibly, someone had discovered the truth about his past. But that was paranoia talking, he told himself. No one knew about those medals except Emma, and their conversation 3 weeks earlier had remained safely contained within the walls of their apartment. "Pretty cool, huh, Dad?" Emma appeared at his elbow, science project in hand, following his gaze to the announcement. "Mrs. Patterson says they're going to have real veterans come talk to us about serving the country. I wonder if any of them will have medals like yours." The casual way she mentioned his medals, as if they were simply another fact about their family life, made Marcus glance around nervously to see if anyone had overheard. But the hallway was emptying as children disappeared into their classrooms, and no one seemed to be paying attention to their conversation. "Emma," Marcus said quietly, "remember what we talked about regarding private information?" "I know, Daddy. I haven't told anyone about your soldier days." "But," she added with the logical precision that sometimes made her seem older than her 8 years, "Mrs. Patterson did ask yesterday if anyone knew veterans personally. And I said yes, but that it was private family information." She seemed to understand. Marcus felt a mixture of pride in Emma's discretion and concern about how long that discretion would hold under the natural curiosity of teachers and classmates. The Veterans Day assembly was still 3 weeks away, but already he could feel the pressure building, the sense that his carefully constructed life of invisible service was about to be disrupted by forces beyond his control. The morning routine proceeded normally. Drop Emma at her classroom, exchange pleasantries with other parents, begin the day's custodial duties with the methodical precision that had become second nature. But underneath the familiar rhythm, Marcus felt hyper-aware of every conversation, every casual mention of military service or patriotic holidays. It was as if his confession to Emma had somehow made him more visible, more vulnerable to discovery. "Morning, Marcus," Carlos called from the supply closet where he was inventorying cleaning chemicals. "You see that announcement about the Veterans Day thing? Pretty fancy setup they're planning this year." Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice casual. "Noticed it on the way in. Sounds like they're going all out. My grandson Miguel asked if I knew any veterans he could interview for a school project," Carlos continued, emerging from the closet with a clipboard covered in neat handwriting. "Kid's got to write a paper about local heroes for his English class. I told him most of the real heroes I know don't like talking about what makes them heroic." The comment felt loaded with meaning, and Marcus found himself studying Carlos's expression for signs that the older man suspected more than he was saying. But Carlos's face carried only its usual thoughtful kindness, without any hint of hidden knowledge or leading questions. "Miguel's a good kid," Marcus replied, returning to his mop with perhaps more focus than the already clean floor required. "Smart enough to understand that some stories take time to tell. Time and trust," Carlos agreed, "both of which seem to be in short supply these days." The remainder of the morning passed without incident, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere at Jefferson Elementary. Conversations that had once felt casual now seemed charged with potential meaning. A parent's offhand comment about military families, a teacher's discussion of local history, even the children's patriotic songs during music class. Everything felt like it carried the possibility of exposure. During his lunch break, Marcus found himself walking past the janitor's closet where those medals remained hidden, fighting the urge to retrieve them and somehow dispose of them permanently. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he recognized it as cowardice rather than wisdom. Those medals represented real experiences, real sacrifice, not just his own, but that of the soldiers he'd served alongside. Destroying them wouldn't erase the past. It would only dishonor the memory of those who hadn't made it. Home, the afternoon brought its own complications, in the form of Janet Rodriguez appearing in the hallway where Marcus was replacing burned-out light fixtures. Her expression carried the particular blend of enthusiasm and determination that Marcus had learned to associate with administrative initiatives that would somehow become his problem. "Marcus, perfect timing," she said, consulting the tablet she carried everywhere like a digital clipboard. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the Veterans Day Assembly. We've had such a positive response from the community that we're expanding the program. Marcus felt his grip tighten on the light fixture he was installing, but kept his voice neutral. Expanding how? Well, instead of just having a few local veterans speak to the children, we're planning a whole community recognition ceremony. Local VFW representatives, city council members, even someone from the congressman's office. It's really turning into something special. Each additional detail felt like another weight added to Marcus's already strained composure. Sounds very comprehensive. The best part is that we're not just focusing on current veterans. We're actively seeking out community members who served but might not be involved in veteran organizations. People who've been quietly serving in civilian roles, whose military background might not be widely known. Janet's enthusiasm seemed to grow with each word. Unaware of how her description was affecting her listener, Marcus set down his screwdriver with careful precision, not trusting his hands to remain steady. How are you identifying these quiet veterans? Oh, it's fascinating, actually. Parents and staff members have been reaching out with suggestions. Mrs. Chen from the corner market mentioned that her nephew thinks his mailman might be a veteran based on comments he's made. The librarian is almost certain that one of her regular patrons has military experience. It's like a community treasure hunt, discovering the heroes who've been living among us all along. The phrase, "heroes living among us," made Marcus's mouth go dry. He could envision all too clearly how such a treasure hunt might eventually lead to his own doorstep. How the careful privacy he'd maintained for 3 years might crumble under the weight of well-meaning community investigation. Have you found many of these quiet veterans? Marcus asked, hating how strained his voice sounded even to his own ears. More than we expected. It's amazing how many people have served without ever mentioning it. We've identified at least 6 community members so far, and I have a feeling there are more we haven't discovered yet. Janet's smile was radiant with the satisfaction of a project exceeding expectations. The goal is to honor them properly, to make sure their service is recognized and appreciated by the next generation. Marcus felt trapped between his desire to escape this conversation and his need to gather information that might help him prepare for whatever was coming. And these community members, they're all willing to participate. Most are, once we explain the purpose. There's been some initial reluctance. I think people who've kept their service private for years are naturally hesitant about suddenly being in the spotlight. But when we frame it as an opportunity to educate children about service and sacrifice, most come around. The casual way Janet described overcoming people's reluctance to be spotlighted made Marcus realize that his own privacy might not be the insurmountable barrier he'd hoped it would be. If the school was actively seeking out quiet veterans and persuading them to participate, his own eventual discovery and recruitment seemed less like a possibility and more like an inevitability. Well, Marcus said carefully, I should get back to these light fixtures. Don't want to leave the hallway half-finished. Of course! But Marcus, Janet paused, her expression shifting to something more personal. I hope you'll consider attending the ceremony, even if you're not directly involved. Emma would love to see her father there, and I think it would mean a lot to her to know you support these kinds of community events. The suggestion was innocuous enough, but it felt like another layer of pressure. Another way that his carefully maintained boundaries were being tested. I'll see what I can do about the schedule, Marcus replied, knowing even as he spoke that he would spend the next 3 weeks trying to find legitimate reasons to be unavailable. That evening, Marcus and Emma walked home through streets that seemed subtly different, as if the approaching Veterans Day Assembly had somehow changed the very air around Jefferson Elementary. Emma chattered about her day with her usual enthusiasm, but Marcus found himself only half listening, too preoccupied with calculating the various ways his secret might be discovered to fully engage with her stories about reading groups and playground politics. Daddy, "You're doing that thing again," Emma observed, as they stopped at the crosswalk 2 blocks from their apartment. "What thing?" "That thing where you look like you're solving a really complicated math problem in your head, except the math problem is making you worried instead of excited." Emma's ability to read his emotional state never failed to catch him off guard. "Is it about the Veterans Day assembly?" Marcus felt his chest tighten. Even Emma had made the connection between his distraction and the upcoming event. "What makes you think that?" "Because you got that look on your face when Mrs. Patterson mentioned it in class today, and then again when Tommy Martinez said his uncle might come speak to our class about being in the Marines. It's the same look you get when we walk past the military recruitment office downtown, like you're remembering something that makes you sad and proud and scared, all at the same time." The accuracy of her observation was startling. Marcus hadn't realized he was so transparent, hadn't understood that Emma had been cataloguing his reactions to military-related topics with the same careful attention she brought to everything else about his behavior. "The assembly is bringing up some complicated feelings," Marcus admitted as they crossed the street toward their building. "Sometimes, when you've been trying to keep part of your life private, having that privacy challenge can feel overwhelming." Emma nodded, with the solemn understanding she brought to adult concepts that existed just beyond her full comprehension. "Like how I felt when Sarah Martinez kept asking why I never talk about my mom, and I didn't know how to explain that talking about her makes me happy and sad at the same time." The parallel Emma drew was painfully accurate. "Exactly like that, sweetheart." They climbed the stairs to their third-floor apartment in comfortable silence. But Marcus could feel Emma processing this new information, working to understand how his military past connected to the upcoming school event and why that connection was causing him distress. "Daddy?" Emma's voice carried that particular tone she used when approaching topics that felt important but potentially fragile. "Are you worried that people will find out about your medals and then treat you differently?" The question was so precisely on target that Marcus stopped on the landing outside their apartment door, key halfway to the lock. "What makes you ask that?" "Because sometimes when people find out something special about someone, they stop seeing them as a regular person and start seeing them as just the special thing. Like how when kids at school found out that Lucy Chen's mom was on TV once, suddenly that was all anyone wanted to talk to Lucy about, even though her mom being on TV didn't change anything about who Lucy actually was." Marcus unlocked their door and followed Emma inside, marveling once again at her ability to distill complex social dynamics into clear, understandable terms. That's exactly what I'm worried about, Emma. For 3 years, I've been able to be just your dad and the janitor at your school. If people find out about the military stuff, I'm afraid that's all they'll see when they look at me." Emma set her backpack down with the careful precision she'd inherited from him, then turned to face him with an expression of serious consideration. "But you know what I think?" "What do you think?" "I think maybe you're worried about the wrong thing. Like maybe instead of worrying about people seeing you differently, you should worry about people not seeing you at all." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that Emma had once again identified something he'd been circling around without quite grasping. "What do you mean?" "Well, if you keep hiding the soldier part of yourself, then people only get to know half of who you really are. And that means they can't really love you completely because they don't know you completely." Emma paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's like if I only told my friends about the parts of myself that I thought they would like, but never told them about the parts that were complicated or sad or hard to understand. They might like me, but they wouldn't really know me." The wisdom in her observation was so profound that Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Here was his 8-year-old daughter, articulating something he'd been struggling with for years, the impossible burden of maintaining false simplicity in a life that was inherently complex, the exhausting weight of performing a version of himself that was authentic but incomplete. "When did you become so wise about relationships, baby girl?" "I've been thinking about it a lot since you told me about being a soldier," Emma replied with characteristic directness. "And I think maybe the reason you're scared isn't because you don't want people to know about the heroic things you did. I think you're scared because you don't want to have to explain why those heroic things make you sad instead of proud." Marcus sank onto their couch, overwhelmed by the accuracy of Emma's psychological diagnosis. She was right, of course. The medals themselves weren't the problem. It was the complex web of memory and loss and survival guilt that came with them. The impossible task of explaining to well-meaning civilians why recognition for military service could feel more like burden than honor. "You're right," Marcus said simply. "I don't know how to explain to people that the things I'm supposedly heroic for are also the things that keep me awake at night sometimes." Emma climbed onto the couch beside him, curling against his side with the natural affection that had been the cornerstone of their relationship since Sarah's death. "Maybe you don't have to explain everything all at once. Maybe you could just start by letting people know that the soldier part of you exists, and then, if they want to understand more, you could decide how much to share based on whether they seem like the kind of people who can handle complicated stories." The suggestion was so practical, so elegantly simple, that Marcus wondered why he hadn't considered it himself. He'd been thinking in terms of all or nothing, complete secrecy or complete disclosure, without considering the possibility of gradual revelation based on trust and understanding. "That's actually a very good plan." "Emma, I know," she said, with the satisfied confidence of someone who'd solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "But can I ask you something else?" "Always. Are you going to go to the Veterans Day assembly?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying with it all the weight of the decisions Marcus would need to make in the coming weeks. He could continue to hide, to manufacture excuses, and maintain the careful boundaries he'd constructed around his past. Or he could trust that the community that had embraced him as Emma's father and the school's janitor might be capable of embracing the full complexity of who he actually was. "I don't know yet," Marcus said honestly. "But I promise I'll think about it, really think about it, not just automatically assume that hiding is the safest option." Emma nodded, seemingly satisfied with this level of commitment to consideration. "Good, because I think maybe it's time for people to know that my daddy isn't just really good at making elephant pancakes and keeping schools clean. I think it's time for them to know that my daddy is also someone who took care of other people when they needed it most, even when it was scary and dangerous." The pride in Emma's voice when she described his military service was a revelation. Marcus had been so focused on protecting her from the complexities of his past that he'd failed to consider that she might actually take pride in his service, might see it as something worth sharing rather than something requiring concealment. "You're proud of the soldier part of me?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Of course I am. Just like I'm proud of the daddy part and the janitor part and all the other parts that make you who you are." Emma's tone suggested that this should have been obvious. The soldier part is what taught you how to take care of people, and how to be brave when things are scary, and how to make hard decisions when you have to. Those are all things that make you a better daddy. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for so long that he'd forgotten it was there. For 3 years, he'd been treating his military experience like a shameful secret, something that needed to be hidden to protect the image of gentle domesticity he'd tried to cultivate. But Emma saw it differently. Not as a contradiction to who he was as her father, but as preparation for it. "I love you, Emma Thompson," Marcus said, pulling her closer against his side. "More than all the stars in Jupiter's sky. I love you too, Daddy, all of you, even the parts that are complicated and hard to understand." That night, after Emma had gone to bed and the apartment had settled into its familiar evening quiet, Marcus found himself standing in front of the janitor's closet on the 2nd floor of Jefferson Elementary. His keycard still worked after hours, a privilege he'd never abused, but which now felt like an invitation to confront the truth he'd been Avoiding the cardboard box sat exactly where he'd left it 3 weeks earlier, pushed deep into the corner behind cleaning supplies and forgotten inventory forms. Marcus pulled it out with hands that shook only slightly, carrying it to the empty classroom across the hall where moonlight, through the windows, provided enough illumination to see. The medals spilled across the teacher's desk with the same metallic clatter that had first revealed them. But this time, Marcus didn't feel the panicked urge to hide them away immediately. Instead, he sat in one of the small student chairs and really looked at them for the first time in 3 years, allowing himself to remember not just the actions that had earned them, but the men whose lives had been affected by those actions. Sergeant Daniel Walsh, 22 years old, who'd stepped on an IED while on patrol and would have bled out in the mountains of Kandahar if Marcus hadn't crossed 50 yards of enemy fire to reach him and establish a medical position. Danny was 25 now, Marcus realized, probably married or in college or starting a career somewhere in Ohio where he'd grown up. The bronze star on the desk represented 30 minutes of terror and training, but for Danny, it represented a lifetime of possibilities that might not have existed otherwise. The Purple Heart carried the weight of Specialist Maria Santos, 19 years old and tougher than most of the men in their unit, who'd taken shrapnel while defending their forward operating base against insurgent attack. Marcus had been wounded in the same engagement, but had continued to coordinate defensive positions until the attack was repelled and medical evacuation could arrive safely. Maria had lost her left leg below the knee, but had gone on to compete in Paralympic racing. She sent Christmas cards every year to the last address she had for him, but those cards had been forwarded through 3 moves and 2 states before finally reaching him in Chicago. Each medal connected him to specific people, specific moments when his training and instincts and willingness to act had made the difference between life and death for soldiers under his command. The recognition wasn't really about him. Marcus realized it was about the value the military placed on actions that preserved life, that demonstrated the kind of leadership that brought people home alive. Sitting in that empty classroom, surrounded by the evidence of children's learning and growth, Marcus began to understand what Emma had been trying to tell him. These medals weren't a burden to be hidden. They were proof that the same instincts that made him a careful father, the drive to protect, to serve, to put others' well-being before his own comfort, had once operated in. Sitting in that empty classroom, surrounded by the evidence of children's learning and growth, Marcus began to understand what Emma had been trying to tell him. These medals weren't a burden to be hidden. They were proof that the same instincts that made him a careful father, the drive to protect, to serve, to put others' well-being before his own comfort, had once operated in circumstances that required different kinds of courage. The silver star felt different in his hands now, less like a weight and more like a bridge between the man he'd been and the father he'd become. It represented the night when his forward operating base had been overrun, when he'd organized the defense that saved 43 soldiers while coordinating evacuation under heavy fire. But it also represented the leadership skills he used every day now, the ability to remain calm under pressure, to make decisions that prioritized others' safety, to find solutions when systems broke down. Marcus gathered the medals carefully, but instead of hiding them away again, he placed them in a small box that he tucked into his work locker. Not displayed, not advertised, but no longer buried in shame and secrecy. They would be there when he was ready to share them, when the right moment presented itself naturally, rather than being forced by circumstances beyond his control. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Jefferson Elementary. Marcus was replacing air fresheners in the main hallway when he noticed a man in a crisp dress uniform speaking with Principal Rodriguez near the main office. Even from a distance, Marcus could identify the insignia of a Navy chaplain, and something about the man's bearing suggested this wasn't a routine visit. "Marcus," Principal Rodriguez called. waving him over with an expression that mixed excitement with something that might have been concern. "I'd like you to meet Chaplain David Chen. He's here to help coordinate our Veterans Day ceremony." Marcus approached slowly, hyper-aware of how his custodial uniform and work-worn hands might appear to someone accustomed to military bearing and protocol. But Chaplain Chen extended his hand with genuine warmth, his grip firm but not performative. "Pleasure to meet you, Marcus. Janet tells me you're one of the people who really makes this school function." Chen's voice carried the particular quality that Marcus remembered from military chaplains, authority tempered by genuine care for others. "I understand you work closely with the children here." "I try to keep things clean and safe for them," Marcus replied carefully, uncertain where this conversation was headed. "That's important work. Some of the most essential service happens behind the scenes, doesn't it?" Jen's observation felt loaded with meaning that Marcus couldn't quite decipher. "I was just telling Janet about our plans for the Veterans Day ceremony. We're hoping to create something meaningful that honors service in all its forms." Principal Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. "Chaplain Chen has such wonderful ideas about involving the whole community. He was just explaining how military service often continues in civilian life through different kinds of contribution." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the sense that this conversation was heading toward territory he wasn't prepared to navigate. "That sounds very thoughtful." "The thing is," Chen continued, his tone shifting to something more personal, "we're looking for community members who understand service from the inside. People who can speak authentically about what it means to continue serving after the uniform comes off." The directness of the statement made Marcus wonder if somehow his secret had already been discovered, if this conversation was actually a recruitment rather than a casual introduction. "I'm not sure I follow." Chen exchanged a glance with Principal Rodriguez that seemed to communicate something beyond Marcus's understanding. "Marcus, I wonder if I might speak with you privately for a few minutes. There's something I'd like to discuss." Principal Rodriguez excused herself with a smile that suggested she knew exactly what was about to happen, leaving Marcus alone with a man whose professional expertise involved recognizing the signs of military experience in others. "Walk with me?" Chen suggested, gesturing toward the empty playground visible through the main entrance. They stepped outside into the crisp October air, the playground equipment casting long shadows across the asphalt. Chen moved with the measured pace of someone comfortable with silence, waiting until they were well away from the building before speaking again. 12 years, Army, I'm guessing," Chen said quietly. "Infantry, probably special operations given how you carry yourself. Afghanistan, definitely maybe Iraq before that. Command position, based on how you automatically scan for exits and assess threats, even in civilian settings." Marcus stopped walking, his heart hammering against his ribs. "How did you— It's what I do, son. I've been a military chaplain for 15 years, and I've learned to recognize the signs. The way you stand, the way you observe, the way you deflect questions about your past. But mostly it's the way you take care of people, that particular combination of competence and protectiveness that comes from being responsible for soldiers' lives." The accuracy of Chen's assessment was both impressive and terrifying. Marcus felt exposed, as if all his careful camouflage had been stripped away in a single conversation. "I don't talk about my service." "I figured as much." "The question is why?" Chen's tone remained gentle but persistent. "In my experience, veterans who work this hard to hide their service usually have good reasons. Sometimes it's survivor guilt. Sometimes it's the difficulty of explaining complex experiences to people who weren't there. Sometimes it's the fear that recognition will somehow cheapen or misrepresent what actually happened." Each possibility Chen mentioned hit uncomfortably close to home. "All of the above, I suppose. Marcus, can I ask you something? What would happen if people in this community knew about your military service?" The question forced Marcus to confront fears he'd been avoiding for 3 years. "They'd see me differently. They'd ask questions I don't know how to answer. They'd expect me to be proud of things that mostly just make me sad. Chen nodded with the understanding of someone who'd heard similar confessions countless times. And what would happen to your relationship with your daughter if people knew? Emma already knows, Marcus admitted, surprised by his own willingness to share this information. I told her a few weeks ago. She handled it better than I expected. Of course she did. Children are remarkably good at accepting complexity in the people they love. It's adults who struggle with that. Chen paused beside the swing set where Emma played every day during recess. Marcus, I'm not here to out you or pressure you into anything you're not ready for. But I will say this. In 15 years of working with veterans, I've learned that secrets have a way of becoming heavier over time, not lighter. Marcus felt tears he'd been holding back for years, threatening to surface. I just want to be Emma's dad. That's the only job that matters to me now, and you're probably the best father she could have. Precisely because of what you learned in the military about service and sacrifice and taking care of people. Chen's voice carried absolute conviction. But what if being Emma's dad could include helping other children understand what service looks like? What if your example could teach them that heroes come in all forms, including janitors who make sure schools are safe and clean? The possibility Chen presented was one Marcus had never considered, that his military experience might enhance rather than complicate his civilian service, that his story might have value for the community that had embraced him and Emma. The Veterans' Day ceremony, Marcus said slowly. You want me to participate. I want you to consider it, not as a performance or a political statement, but as a way of showing children that service continues in many forms, that the people who take care of them every day might have stories of taking care of others in different circumstances. Marcus looked out across the playground where Emma spent her days learning and growing, where she'd made friends and discovered interests and built the foundation for whatever future awaited her. This place had become home for both of them, a community that had welcomed them without reservation. Maybe Chen was right. Maybe it was time to trust that community with the whole truth about who he was. I'd need to think about it, Marcus said finally. Of course. And Marcus, whatever you decide, it needs to be your choice, made for your reasons. Not because someone else thinks it's what you should do, but because you believe it serves your daughter and this community in the way you want to serve. That evening, Marcus and Emma sat at their kitchen table working on homework, Emma with her math worksheets, Marcus with the impossible equation of how to integrate his past with his present. The medals sat in their small box on the counter, no longer hidden but not yet displayed, existing in the uncertain space between secrecy and revelation. Daddy? Emma looked up from her fractions with an expression of serious consideration. Can I tell you something I've been thinking about? Always. I think maybe the reason you're scared about people knowing about your soldier days isn't really about you. I think it's about me. Marcus set down his pen, giving her his complete attention. What do you mean? I think you're worried that if people know about the brave things you did before I was born, they might think that being my daddy isn't as important or impressive. Like maybe they'd think you gave up being a hero to become just a regular father. The insight was so accurate, it took Marcus's breath away. Emma had identified something he hadn't even fully recognized himself, that his fear of revelation wasn't just about personal exposure, but about protecting the identity he'd built as her father from being overshadowed by recognition for his military service. But here's the thing, Daddy, Emma continued, with the logical precision that never failed to amaze him. Being my dad is the most heroic thing you've ever done. Taking care of me every single day, making sure I feel safe and loved and ready to face whatever comes next, that's not less than being a soldier. It's more, because soldiers take care of people for a job, but daddies take care of people for love. Marcus felt the last of his resistance crumble under the weight of his daughter's wisdom. Emma, how did you get so smart about what matters? I had a good teacher, she said with a smile that lit up their small kitchen. So are you going to tell people about your medals at the Veterans' Day assembly? Marcus looked at his daughter, brilliant, compassionate, wise beyond her years, and realized that she was right about everything. His service in Afghanistan had prepared him to be her father, and his service as her father had given meaning to everything he'd done in the military. They weren't separate identities competing for recognition. They were parts of the same story about what it meant to care for others. "Yes," he said simply. "I think I am." The Veterans Day Assembly at Jefferson Elementary took place on a Thursday morning in November, with the gymnasium decorated in red, white, and blue bunting and filled with children, parents, and community members. Marcus stood in the back with the other veterans who'd been invited to speak, his dress uniform carefully pressed and his medals properly displayed for the first time in 3 years. Emma sat in the front row with her third-grade class, her face radiant with pride as Principal Rodriguez introduced the community members who'd served their country in uniform and continued serving in civilian roles. When Marcus's name was called, the applause was warm and sustained, but what mattered most was the sight of Emma beaming at him from across the room. "Sometimes," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his chest, "people think that being a hero means doing extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. But what I've learned is that heroism is really about doing ordinary things, taking care of people, keeping them safe, making sure they have what they need, even when it's difficult or dangerous or thankless." He looked out at the sea of young faces, including Emma's, and understood that this was exactly where he belonged, not hiding from his past, but using it to help build a better future for the children who would inherit the world he'd once fought to protect. "The most important thing I ever learned in the army," Marcus continued, "is that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just changes form. Today, instead of taking care of soldiers, I get to take care of all of you by making sure your school is clean and safe. And most importantly, I get to take care of my daughter Emma, who teaches me every day what it really means to be brave." The applause that followed was more than recognition. It was acceptance, understanding, and gratitude for the complete truth of who he was and who he'd chosen to become. After the ceremony, as parents and children gathered around the veterans to ask questions and express thanks, Emma made her way through the crowd to stand beside her father. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," she said simply, slipping her hand into his. "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. Thank you for helping me remember that all the parts of who we are matter, even the complicated ones." Marcus Thompson continued working as the custodian at Jefferson Elementary, but he was no longer hiding. His service record became part of his story, integrated naturally into his role as both father and community member. Children began stopping by his office to ask questions about military life. Parents sought his perspective on teaching courage and resilience. And Emma grew up understanding that heroism came in many forms, including the form of a father who'd learned to serve with both strength and gentleness. The medals found their place in a small display case in the school's main hallway, not as Marcus Thompson's awards, but as reminders that heroes lived and worked among them every day, taking care of others in ways both seen and unseen, both past and present, both extraordinary and beautifully essentially ordinary. Stories like Marcus and Emma's remind us that heroism exists all around us. If you enjoyed this journey of courage and family love, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring true stories that celebrate the extraordinary within the ordinary.